Remark 2. Yet another reason can be cited that helps to explain the resistance to the proposition about being and nothing. This reason is that, as expressed in the proposition, being and nothing are one and the same. The result of considering being and nothing is incomplete. The accent falls primarily on the being one and the same, as is the case in judgment generally, where the predicate says what the subject is. Consequently, the sense seems to be that the distinction is denied which yet patently occurs in the proposition at the same time, for the proposition says both determinations, being and nothing, and contains them as distinguished. At the same time, the meaning cannot be that abstraction ought to be made from the two determinations and only their unity retained. This sense would be manifestly one-sided, and only their unity one-sided, since that from which abstraction would be made is equally present in the proposition and explicitly named there. Now, insofar as the proposition being and nothing are the same expresses the identity of these determinations, yet in fact equally contains the two as distinguished, it internally contradicts itself and thus dissolves itself. And if we concentrate on this result, what we have before us is a proposition which, on closer inspection, turns out to vanish spontaneously. It has movement, but in thus vanishing, it is its proper content which comes to be in it. Namely becoming. The proposition thus contains the result. It is this result implicit in it, but the circumstance to which we must pay attention here is the defect that this result is not itself expressed in the proposition. It is external reflection that recognizes it there. In this connection, we must observe right at the beginning that the proposition, in the form of a judgment, is not adept to express speculative truths. Recognition of this circumstance would go a long way in preventing many misunderstandings of speculative truths. Judgment joins subject and object in a connection of identity. Abstraction is therefore made from the fact that the subject has yet more determinacies than the predicate has, just as that the predicate is wider than the subject. Now, if the content is speculative, the non-identity of subject and predicate is also an essential moment, but this is not expressed in judgment. The paradoxical and even bizarre light in which much of recent philosophy is cast for those not intimate with speculative thought is due in many ways to the form of the simple judgment when used to convey speculative results. For the purpose of expressing the speculative truths, the defect is first remedied by adding the contrary proposition, namely being and nothing are not the same, which we also stated above. But another defect then crops up, for these propositions are disconnected and therefore present, their content only in an antinomy, whereas the content refers to one and the same thing, and the determinations expressed in the two propositions should be united absolutely, in a union which can then only be said to be an unrest of simultaneous incompatibles, a movement. The commonest injustice done to a speculative content is to render it one-sidedly, that is, to give a prominence only to one of the propositions in which it can be resolved. This proposition is then undeniably asserted, but the statement is just as false as it is correct. For once one proposition is taken out of its speculative context, the other also must be given at least as much attention and articulation. Attention must also be drawn at this point to, so to speak, the unfortunate word unity. Unity, even more so than identity, designates a subjective reflection. It is normally taken as a connection that arises from comparison, from external reflection, inasmuch as this reflection finds the same thing in two different subject matters. A unity is there with respect to which complete indifference is presupposed on the part of the subject matters compared, so that the comparing and the unity do not touch these subject matters themselves, but are rather a doing and a determining external to them. Unity thus expresses a totally abstract sameness, and it will sound all the harsher and the more discordant the more the terms of which it is asserted show themselves to be utterly distinct. For this reason, it would therefore be better to say simply unseparateness and inseparability, but then the affirmative aspect of the connection of the whole would not be expressed. So the whole true result that we have here before us is becoming, but a becoming which is not the merely one-sided or abstract unity of being and nothing. It consists rather in this movement, that pure being is immediate and simple, and for that very reason is just as much pure nothing, and that the distinction between them is, but equally sublates itself and is not. This result does also assert, therefore, the distinction of being and nothing, but it asserts it as one which is merely intended. The ordinary assumption is that being is the absolutely other of nothing, and that there is nothing as clear as this absolute distinction. Indeed, nothing seems easier than being able to state it, but it is just as easy to convince oneself that this is impossible, that the distinction is unsayable. Let those who insist on the distinction of being and nothing, let them just try to state in what the distinction consists. If being and nothing had any determinateness differentiating them, then, as we said, they would be determinate being and determinate nothing, not the pure being and the pure nothing, which they still are at this point. Their distinction is therefore completely empty. Each is as indeterminate as the other. The distinction depends, therefore, not on them, but on a third element, on intention. But intention is a form of subjectivity, and subjectivity does not belong to the present order of exposition. The third element in which being and nothing have their subsistence must, however, also be present here, and it is present indeed. It is becoming. In becoming, they are present as distinct. Becoming only occurs to the extent that they are distinguished. This third is another than they. They subsist only in another, which is equivalent to saying that they do not subsist on their own. Becoming equally is the subsistence of being and of non-being, or their subsistence is only their being in a one. Precisely this, their subsistence in a one, is that which equally sublates their distinction. The challenge to produce the distinction between being and nothing also brings with it the challenge to state what, then, is being, and what is nothing. Those who resist acknowledging that the two are equally only a transition of the one into the other, and who assert this or that being and nothing, let them declare whereof they speak, that is, let them advance a definition of being and nothing, and let them demonstrate that it is correct. Without having satisfied this first demand of the ancient science, whose logical rules they otherwise accept and apply, All their assertions about being and nothing are only assurances without scientific validity. If it has somewhere been said that existence, which is held from the start to be equivalent to being, is the completion of possibility, then another determination, namely possibility, is presupposed along with it, so being is not declared in its immediacy but precisely as not standing on its own, as conditioned. For being which is mediated, we shall reserve the expression concrete existence. But the common practice is to imagine being, as if it were a picture of pure light, the clarity of unclouded seeing, and then nothing is the pure night. And the distinction between the two is then enshrined into this well-known sensuous difference. But in fact, if this very seeing is more accurately imagined, one can readily perceive that in absolute light one sees just as much and just as little as in absolute darkness, that the one seeing is just as good as the other, that pure seeing is a seeing of nothing. Pure light and pure darkness are two voids that amount to the same thing, only indeterminate light, and light is determined through darkness. In clouded light, therefore, just as only indeterminate darkness, and darkness is determined through light, in illuminated darkness thereof, therefore, can something be distinguished, since only clouded light and illuminated darkness have distinction in them, and hence are determinate being, existence.